Honored to introduce our next speaker, Ronald O'Rourke. Ronald O'Rourke is a Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Johns Hopkins University, where he received his BA in International Studies, and valedictorian graduate of the university's Paul Nitze School of Advanced International Studies, where he received an MA. Since 1984, Ron has worked as a naval analyst for the Congressional Research Service of the Library of Congress. He regularly briefs members of Congress and congressional staffers, and he's testified before congressional committees. In 1996, he received the Distinguished Service Award from the Library of Congress for his work to Congress on naval issues. In 2012, Ron O'Rourke received CRS Director's Award for Outstanding Contribution for Support to Congress and the mission of CRS. Ron is also the author of several journal articles, and he is the winner of the Naval Institute's Arleigh Burke Essay Contest. He's contributed a number of times to Proceedings magazine. That essay where he won the prize and many other Proceedings article contributions have focused on the need for the Navy to articulate its strategy. Ron O'Rourke.
Is this turned on?
Yes.
All right. And the green arrow changes the slides? All right. I'm going to stand out here just to get a little closer to that television. Thank you very much to the Institute for inviting me today. I'm very happy to be here. And I'm going to take you through a presentation that focuses first on strategy and then looks more at resources. So let's start here just with the usual disclaimer that these views are my own, not necessarily those of my employer. Although I do work for an organization that tees issues up, it's one that does not make recommendations. And consistent with that general approach to my work at CRS, this presentation too will not make recommendations. It will present issues and options for you to consider. So the conference topic, as you know, is what does the nation need from its sea services? And for me, in addressing this question, an initial issue to consider is the moment of time that we're caught in right now, because we happen to be right now in the midst of what many people believe is a shift in strategic eras. So we are asking this question at a very particular time, as it turns out. World events since late last year have convinced a number of people that the world right now is shifting from one strategic era to another, from the familiar post-Cold War era of the last 20 or 25 years, or the unipolar moment, as some people have called it, with the United States being the unipolar power, to a new and different strategic era, characterized by renewed great power competition, by renewed ideological competition against 21st century forms of authoritarianism, and by challenges to key elements of the US-led international order that has operated since World War II. Now, that's significant if you think we are in a shift like that, because the last time we had a shift in strategic eras, it led to a broad reassessment of our defense plans and programs, and to many changes in those programs. And they were encapsulated in a document called the BottomUp Review, or the BUR, in 1993, a document and a review process whose very name suggested how people were going down to basics and then building things up from scratch. That's how broad the reassessment was. It was the BUR, by the way, that led eventually to the quadrennial defense review process that we have in place today. So if we had a review like that the last time we shifted strategic eras, it's possible, therefore, that we may once again now have another such review of the terms of debate over U.S. defense plans and programs. And those current terms of debate are structured by things such as the Budget Control Act, the Strategic Defense Guidance, and the most recent QDR. So if we are going to have a reassessment of the terms of debate over U.S. defense, it might be helpful, as one thing to do as part of that process, to reacquaint ourselves with certain aspects of U.S. grand strategy that bear on the sea services. We haven't had to talk very much about U.S. grand strategy over the last 70 years or so, because for a long time during that period, all we had to do was point to the Soviet Union, and that answered the question. I read a journal article that said that, in effect, the Soviet Union, in being there as a device for people to point to, was clearer than the truth. You could just point to the country, and you didn't have to really know the theory that you were invoking behind it. So for a long time, all we had to do was point at the Soviet Union. And then after the Cold War ended, we were in that unipolar moment. We were the sole superpower in the world. And so for that reason, too, we didn't have to ground ourselves in discussions of grand strategy. So as a country, we haven't been spending a lot of time over the last 70 years or so talking about grand strategy and investigating it, learning it, transmitting it on to others. But we might now be in a moment where we have to now once again do that for the first time since the late 1940s, because we may now be entering an era of renewed great power competition, but not one with a single overriding adversary as there was during the Cold War, where we could simply point to it and short-circuit the learning process. So if it's the case that we might now need to reacquaint ourselves with grand strategy and the elements of it that bear on the sea services, what are a couple of things that you might say? Well, I'll give you a couple right here. And as Iggy Azalea says, let's start with first things first. So here's a nice picture of the world. It's mostly water, and it reminds us of something that I think everybody in this room is very familiar with, but we're so familiar with it that it becomes very easy to take for granted and treat as wallpaper and overlook and ignore. And that's the fact that the world is covered more than 2/3 by water, and that water exists in the form of a global commons. And what that means is that naval forces, US naval forces, while not being inexpensive, give the United States the ability to convert that global commons into a medium of operations for defending and promoting US interests. And our ability to do that, to convert that global commons into a medium of operations for us, is a huge asymmetric advantage for the United States. Again, one that is so long-standing and so ubiquitous and so instinctively understood, I think, by pretty much everybody in this room, that again, it's very easy to take for granted and overlook and forget. But when we talk about who has asymmetric advantages or asymmetric strategies, let's remember that we have one that we've been applying for a long time, and it's absolutely huge. It operates on a global basis. This point wouldn't be quite as important if less of the world were covered by water, or if that water were carved up into territorial blocks like the land. But most of the world is covered by water, and most of that water does exist in the form of international water. So this isn't an argument that naval forces are special or inherently privileged in some way. It is simply a consequence of the physical and legal organization of the planet. This is what we need to reacquaint ourselves with. So in this context, it might be said that it's not the sea services that have a maritime strategy. It's the nation that has a maritime strategy. The sea services are simply an instrumentality for implementing it. So if the question is, what does the nation need from its sea services? One possible answer would be an ability to convert that global commons into a medium of advantage for us and to deny the same to other countries. And that's one possible answer to that question, because although I've been taking you through a little discourse here on traditional American grand strategy, that is something for policymakers to decide whether we want to continue doing that or not. So it's a choice for policymakers to decide whether we want to continue with this. But we at least ought to reacquaint ourselves with it so that we know that it's a question we can address. Okay, here's another picture. It's one that's been showing up in briefings around town. You can get it off of various websites. Someone checked it, and it seems to be true. It's got India and China in it, and you add that to some of the other countries there, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Indonesia, and Japan, and yeah, about 51% of the people in the world. Just slightly more than half live inside that circle. And I'm using this visual as a reminder of something else that's very basic about the world that we understand instinctively, but we tend to perhaps take for granted and overlook or even forget because, again, we haven't been thinking about grand strategy for a long time. And that's that most of the world's people and resources and economic activity is not resident here in the Western Hemisphere, but in the other hemisphere, and particularly in Eurasia. And in response to that very basic fact about world geography, US leaders traditionally have chosen to pursue a grand strategy in which we attempt to prevent the emergence of regional hegemons in one part of Eurasia or another, on the grounds that such a regional hegemon, if it were to emerge, could threaten core US interests in one way or another. Now, this implicitly has been an element of our grand strategy all through these past 70 years, and to some degree even as far back as World War I, if you want to predate it that far. But it was articulated that way in the 1940s. And much of our military operations, both in wartime and in peacetime, in one way or another, or to some degree, have been traceable back, at least in part, to this concept. And what that means is that we design our forces, quite unlike what other countries have, so that they can essentially pick themselves up and move themselves to another hemisphere and then engage in large-scale, sustained military operations in that other hemisphere. And that drives certain things about our force design. It means we have an Air Force with a lot of long-range capability, unlike pretty much anyone else's Air Force. And it means we have a Navy that is similarly structured to have a lot of long-range capability, which makes our Navy unlike the navies of other countries. So again, if the question is what do we need from our sea services, another possible response to that answer would be, well, it would be to have a capability operating alongside the other military forces to operate so as to affect events in Eurasia, particularly in connection with the goal of preventing the emergence of regional hegemons. And again, whether we want to do this in the future is a choice, because again, this is reacquainting ourselves with traditional US grand strategy, but we have the choice of whether we want to continue that or not. But if you were to continue it, then it might lead to an answer like this. Okay, well, whether you agree or disagree or want to do either of those first two things, it remains the case that we have a lot of interests of various kinds as a country in various places around the world. And to defend those interests, we have to engage in operations of various kinds. And this is when you begin to tick off the roles and missions of the sea services or the broad kinds of operations they are. Here's one version of that list. It's not intended to be comprehensive. You've seen many versions of this list over the years, I'm sure. And I'm not putting this up here to teach you any of those things. And it's not intended to include every such thing you can put on the list, but just to suggest the range of operations, and also to note the fact that a lot of those things are things that traditionally our country has wanted to do on a frequent or continuous basis, and that means therefore they are to be done by forward deployed forces that tend to be there a lot or all of the time. So a third possible answer to that question would be, well, if you're asking what you want the sea services to do, it would be to have an ability to maintain forward deployments, because a lot of those missions need that, and to perform a spectrum of operations that includes all the things you saw on that list on the previous slide, plus others that I didn't have room to list. So that's three possible answers for what you might want the sea services to do. And to some degree, it's rooted, again, in concepts of strategy that we haven't had to think about very much over the last 70 years, but which, because of this shift in strategic eras that some people feel we are in the midst of, we may now need to reacquaint ourselves with that theory and use it to ground our thinking about what it is we want the sea services to be able to do. Okay, so the challenge in doing things like that, if you agree that you want the sea services to be able to do one or more of those three things, is you have to have both capacity and capability. Capacity is a quantitative measure. It refers to numbers, and capability is a qualitative measure, your ability to do different kinds of things. So you have to have adequate capacity, especially for maintaining forward deployments, and do so on a sustained basis without wearing out your people and equipment. And you have to have capability for being able to do things. And currently there is a major challenge in that regard in terms of our current and future ability to counter the A2AD forces that are emerging in various countries around the world. And you have to do all that within available resources. So there's sort of a triangle there of capacity and capability resources, and you have to find some way of making that triangle work and connecting all three sides of it. Well, the Naval Institute, in inviting me to this presentation, asked me to focus very much on the resources end. So I am going to now spend a little bit of time shifting from the strategy stuff that I've just taken you through to talk a little bit more about resources. Well, what are the prospects for the Department of the Navy for having the resources necessary to connect up that triangle that I just spoke about so that you can have both adequate capacity and capability? When I think about what the prospects are for future Department of the Navy resources, I usually think of it in terms of a cascade of three issues. So I first ask myself, well, what can I say or think about where the DoD top line might go? And quite often that's where a lot of the discussions end, and then they just assume an answer to the next two questions. And the second question being, what is the division of resources between the various parts of DoD, and then third, what is the internal composition of DoD spending and what it therefore enables in terms of being able to carry out acquisition and maintain force structure for both capacity and capability. So this is a cascade of issues. So what can we say about these three things? Well, in terms of the first, what you can say is that recent world events, these things that have convinced some people that we're shifting into a new strategic era, have created an argument that you are now hearing around town, made by some, for increasing defense spending to higher levels. And what that's meeting up against is the Budget Control Act, which is, as I'm sure you've heard many times already today, let alone in previous days and weeks and months, is the thing that limits defense spending to certain levels. A lot of people don't like the Budget Control Act, but it is an act that has a lot of legislative stability for reasons that we can go into in the Q&A session, if you like. So you have this argument being made by some for higher levels of defense spending, but it's being pushed up against the BCA, which is like this big boulder that got dumped in your front lawn, and you may not like it, but it takes a lot of energy to move that boulder out of the way, and it's not clear yet where that's going to go. But whatever you think the DoD top line might be, you would then follow down to the next question is, well, what about the Navy's share of that top line? And you can see I've listed three things that play into that debate. Now, up until about a year ago, the first of those three bullets was really the only one of those three that you would mention. And when that was the only bullet to focus on, the one relating to the strategic rebalancing toward the Asia-Pacific, it tended to create a pretty clear and strong argument for allocating a larger share of the DoD top line, whatever it might be, to the Navy and to some degree the Air Force, because the Asia-Pacific theater is for the United States a theater that is very much oriented toward naval and air forces. But that situation now within the last year has changed, and the other two bullets are there. And that is now pulling attention back to our forces and operations in Europe. And of course, we have a new commitment to combat the Islamic State organization in the Middle East. So that has tended to create now a more mixed situation. And so on the second variable, which up until a year ago looked like one where you could make an argument pretty clearly for devoting a larger share of the DoD top line to the Navy and to some degree to the Air Force, that situation is now more mixed, because clearly when you talk about Europe, you're talking about devoting more resources to the Army and to some degree to the Air Force. Our operations against Islamic State are primarily in the form of air power, and naval aviation is a part of that, but so is the Air Force. So this situation is more mixed now with the addition of those two other bullets than it was a year ago, when it was only that first bullet standing by itself. And then there's the third variable, which is, all right, you have your DON top line, whatever it is, whatever share of the DoD top line it turned out to be, and then what about the composition of that budget and what it allows in terms of acquisition and force structure. And here, the situation is one of internal pressures on the DON budget, just as the other services have, that are created by weapon acquisition and O&M costs, by personnel pay and benefits issues, and by base-related costs, and things that you might characterize to some degree as back office costs or overhead costs. And that tends to limit also the amount of money, therefore, available to spend for capacity and capability. So I've taken you through that. I'm going to focus now on a couple of these. I'm going to show you a couple of slides that bear on the issue of shares of the DoD top line, the second of those three issues. And then down below on internal pressures, I'm going to pick out as a for example one thing to look at, which is the personnel pay and benefits. In picking these things, it's because I don't have time to go through everything. I'm just going to give you 4 examples. But let's do a for example on the DON share of the DoD top line and the idea of shares, because a lot of the time it is asserted that those shares are equal, that they are stable or fixed. And as you can see in this chart, which was prepared by my CBO colleague, Eric Labs, who I think is here today, right? There he is, okay. What you can see is that that's not really the case. These shares have not been as fixed and stable as they are often made out to be. The 4th category of spending, the defense-wide category, has been growing over time. The other 3 lines have therefore have a slight downward slope to them. And then if we take away the 4th category and just focus on the other 3 lines, you'll see that yeah, there was a period of stability between about 1973 and 2003, about 30 years, when those shares did bounce around but were basically stable. And it was during this time that the concept and the idea and the belief of 1/3, 1/3, and of fixed shares, I think, began to take hold because the numbers seemed to support it. But when you look at the broad sweep of time, both before that period and in the last 10 years since then, what you can see is that's not really the case. And during the New Look period that Chairman Forbes mentioned earlier, the Air Force had a much higher share of the budget, and during the years of our wartime operations in Southwest Asia, the Army had a much higher share. And you can say that the second of those 2 examples, the Army, well, that's war, those are wartime, and that's true. But a lot of that wartime spending was the war in Iraq, and the war in Iraq can be understood as an expression, as a consequence of how U.S. leaders interpreted U.S. national strategy. So it was a consequence of policy and strategy. So over the broader sweep of history, things have not always been fixed or stable. There have been periods when these shares have shifted. So that's just one, for example, of things you can think about in that cascade of 3 issues that I went through earlier. Now let's go to a couple slides that go to that 3rd issue, which has to do with the composition of the DON budget, pressures in it. I'll just show you a couple things on one aspect of that I'm just picking out because I can't talk about everything today. And it's just the, for example, of personnel pay and benefits. This is a slide that my late colleague Steve Daggett at CRS prepared on per capita, that is per troop, cash and deferred cash compensation, and how it has changed over recent years. And this is in real terms. This is after adjusting for inflation. So when he takes inflation out and creates a real calculation, what you can see is that after being stable for some period of time, more or less, that number has shot up by more than 50% over the last decade or so. And Steve would prepare this chart every year, and he kept adding another year to it. This was the very last one, I think, that he prepared before he passed away 2 years ago. But he briefed this chart to the House Budget Committee and to other people on Capitol Hill. And he was really, I think, instrumental in identifying this metric as a way of at least understanding where we are going in terms of a factor that contributes to the pressures that the services face on their budgets. Well, Steve's no longer with us, but other people have now taken up that calculation. And here's that same calculation, more or less, as done by AEI and the Bipartisan Policy Center. How you do this calculation can differ depending on what you include in it, what deflator you use. They have done it, and they've calculated the real per capita increase over a comparable period at about 42%. These are the things that they say have contributed to that 42% gain during the period of time that they measured it. And this is an expression visually of the kind of how much of the DoD budget we are talking about. So if this is the thing that's growing over time, then it tells you something about how much money is left for doing other things. So again, I'm not picking this out as the be-all and the end-all. It's just a for example that was listed in the 3rd of those 3 issues down there. So when you think about future resources for the Department of the Navy, there are 3 issues here. There's not just one. It's not just where the DoD top line is. It's also the second one about the allocation of that between the various parts of DoD. And it's also the 3rd issue of these factors that create internal pressures on the DON budget that you wind up with. Okay, now in the grand tradition of giving single-person discussions about the sea services, I have up until this point completely ignored the Coast Guard. So I'm going to break with that tradition now, and I'm actually going to spend the last few moments of my presentation talking about the Coast Guard, because I think there is a couple of important points that need to, I think, be understood in being able to understand and evaluate the Coast Guard situation. And the first has to do with their program of record for getting new deep water capable cutters and aircraft. And that is that the numbers they have in their plan are roughly 50 to 60% of what the service has calculated they would actually need to fully perform their statutory missions in coming years. So while it's true that the program of record force for new cutters and aircraft will create a force that is a lot more capable than what the Coast Guard has today, that's not the same as saying that it will be a full mission performance force, because by the Coast Guard's calculation, it will fall far short of that. So the program of record force, when measured against mission requirements, is like a glass half full. And that's better than, you know, a glass quarter full or whatever you think the legacy force was capable of. But you should not mistake that for the glass being all the way full. And that is what the Coast Guard is currently hoping and aiming to get at as soon as it can. They want to get to a glass half full. Well, the previous Commandant, Admiral Papp, said on a number of occasions that to execute the Coast Guard's acquisition programs in a timely manner without stretching them out over a terribly long period of time, that the Coast Guard's overall procurement account, as it were, which they call the Acquisition, Construction, and Improvements account, or the AC&I account, would need somewhere between $1.5 or $2 billion a year. And that was a statement that appeared to be pegged to doing the program of record on a timely basis. In other words, to get to that glass half full in a timely manner, you would need, Admiral Papp said, somewhere between $1.5 to $2 billion a year. There was even one mention of $2.5 billion a year, but we'll just keep it at $1.5 or $2 billion a year. If the AC&I account, he said, were instead limited to about $1 billion a year, that, he said, would put the Coast Guard on something like a death spiral. Now, when you look at the Coast Guard's acquisition account and the size of the service they are, and just compare it to the Navy, and if you were to ask yourself, how large would the AC&I account need to be comparable on a per capita basis to the Navy's procurement and acquisition accounts, the answer would be something like $3.5 billion a year. Well, the Navy buys very expensive things. They buy submarines, they buy nuclear-powered ships, they buy high-performance jet aircraft, so you have to discount it somehow. And I don't really know how to precisely discount it, but if you discounted it by an arbitrary factor of 1/3 to 1/2, you're still left with a sense that perhaps the AC&I account, if it were simply made somehow equivalent on a per capita basis with this discounting thrown in to what the Navy invests in equipment for its people to do their missions in the future, that the AC&I account might again be somewhere very roughly in the range of $2 billion a year, plus or minus. Well, this is the Navy, the Coast Guard's AC&I account as it has appeared in the last 3 budget submissions. So the first line is the FY13 submission, and then the 14 and 15 submissions are below it. And you can see on that first line that the Coast Guard's AC&I account was, in fact, about $1.5 billion per year on average over the 5-year period. Okay, so it was not too far out of line with what Admiral Papp was saying. And then in the next submission, the FY14 submission, something big happened. That account was cut by about 1/3 to about $1 billion a year. And to my knowledge, there was no strategic rationale ever offered for why that reduction took place. And I testified on it at the time before the Coast Guard Subcommittee on the House side in June of 2013. That hearing took place on June 26. And I stated in my testimony, I said, first of all, I have not seen a reduction in a 5-year acquisition account this large on a percentage basis since the end of the Cold War. But unlike those large reductions in the acquisition accounts that I remember seeing at the end of the Cold War, I could not really identify a strategic rationale this time around for why there would be such a huge year-to-year change now. But there it was. Now, in the most recent submission, the FY15 submission, the bottom line on that chart, it has moved up a little bit. Okay, it's 1.1. But we're still a lot closer at this point to 1 billion a year than we are to 1.5 or 2 billion a year. And so I want to leave you with a final question here. This is my last slide in the presentation. I think as we move forward in terms of asking what the sea services, including the Coast Guard, should do for the nation in the future, we should also ask ourselves, what are the long-term implications for Coast Guard capacity and capability if the Coast Guard AC&I account is left at about $1.1 billion per year? There was talk earlier about the Coast Guard's difficulty of being able to afford the procurement of a new polar icebreaker to replace one of the two current ones. Well, the reason they can't afford that is that their ACI account is about $1.1 billion a year. So they're looking for ways to somehow otherwise finance the construction of that ship, including possibly getting other parts of the federal government, other agencies to contribute, although there hasn't been too much movement that I've seen on that issue. But the icebreaker is just one expression of this issue. There's a lot of things the Coast Guard cannot do or cannot do at more than a certain speed because their ACI account is at about $1 billion a year. Well, where is that going to take the Coast Guard in the long run if that doesn't change? And remember, what we're talking about, if you want to finance the program of record, is something that in mission terms would get the Coast Guard to what the Coast Guard has calculated would be a glass half full. If they're here and they're falling short of that, then the glass is even less full and will become more so over time. So I wanted to leave you with that as a question to ponder regarding the future of the Coast Guard, because for me, it's a major fork in the road for the future of the service, and one that often gets overlooked because we do spend so much time usually talking about the Department of the Navy when we have presentations on the sea services. So I'll leave you with that. Thank you again very much for your time, and I'll be happy to answer your questions.
And Ron, we've got some great news for you. Our next speakers are delayed by a vote. So we have extra time for questions. And so we can go all the way, if you could stand it, we could go all the way to 14:30 with questions if you want. So I encourage people to come up and hit the microphones, but thank you again.
Mm-hmm. Okay, should I be the person to, okay, I'll scanning the room here.
Brad, hey Ron, Brad Hicks.
Oh, okay.
You mentioned it, but you didn't dig into it too much. For the Navy acquiring new capability and the cost to acquire new capability versus sustaining the existing fleet. And then you did mention, it was mentioned by Congressman Forbes about the cruiser force structure issue in the Navy budget and how they deal with that. In your view, as you analyze the data on the force structure of the Navy, the balance, have you analyzed what we're acquiring versus what we're putting up for the table for offsets in the budget for force structure?
Okay, say that again.
Okay, so right now the Navy wanted to decommission some amphibs and cruisers and put them in special status to an extent. But yet the acquiring of new capability is not keeping pace.
Right.
So as you see the trends now with this budget pressure, have you all taken a look at, as you see the latest authorization versus what you anticipate will come, do you see any closure to that with this, this overall issue you mentioned on the global strategy?
Let me answer the question this way. In terms of people who've looked at the resources issue and what it implies for the future size and structure of the Navy, there are two major sources of answers on that. One is the Navy, and the other is my CBO colleague, Eric Labs. So let me tell you a little bit about the Navy. The Navy actually gave a fairly detailed provisional or notional answer to that question in some testimony that they provided in September of 2013 to the House Armed Services Committee, and then a little later that year, in November of 2013, if I remember the date right, to the Senate Armed Services Committee. And what they said essentially was, what might the Navy look like if the defense budget remains at the levels that are set forth in the Budget Control Act? So again, that was an answer predicated on looking only at the first of those 3 questions. There was somehow some assumption about the second and third questions that was not stated. But the Navy said, all right, well, there's various scenarios for how they could fit themselves under what they think their share of that BCA limited top line might be. And it depends on whether you focus on keeping bigger ships or smaller. If you keep smaller ships, the numbers can be higher and so on. And they said, so therefore, this is just one scenario. But they did lay it out in what I thought was fairly remarkable detail for a piece of testimony, and I do recommend it to you. And what they said, and I'll just give you only a couple of the particulars in an answer that actually had a lot of detail built into it, but they said that we would be looking at a fleet that had 1 to 2 fewer carrier strike groups and 1 to 2 fewer amphibious ready groups than what we have today, and might total somewhere around 250 or 260 ships. And that this fleet would not be capable of fully executing all the missions, I think there's 10 of these missions, that are set forth in the Strategic Defense Guidance. So that's one answer. And the other answer is done by my CBO colleague, Eric Labs. And he cranked through the numbers, and I believe his answer was broadly similar to the Navy's, although I think his total number of ships was a little bit lower than the number I just quoted. And Eric, do you want to come up here and talk a little bit about this? Or?
No. But that is correct. Broadly speaking, it was a little bit lower than what the Navy.
Right. Eric's pricing for ships is a little bit higher in general than what the Navy is. So when Eric looks at the amount of money and divides it out, he gets a total number of ships that's a little bit lower. So I hope that's at least a partial step toward an answer to your question. But this issue of trying to maintain force structure today versus force structure for the future, that is the situation we're in right now. And if the defense budget remains limited to the numbers in the BCA, and if the Navy's share of that budget does not change from where it is, and if the internal composition of the Navy's budget remains about where it is, you will be driven over time to numbers like that. And I think that's about as much as I can say. And in the meantime, we may make trades between the present and the future, between holding on to things we have today versus investing in new platforms, which you might characterize as future readiness as opposed to current day readiness. And you can find various scenarios for that. But I can't pick any one of those that we will necessarily follow. But over time, you will trend toward that kind of a situation.
Hi, sir. Kevin Wensing. Since Admiral Daly gave you some bonus time, I have 2 questions. One, the type of ships and platforms the U.S. Navy purchases, Zumwalt-class destroyers, Ford-class carriers that are going $13, $14, $15 billion a copy. Should the Navy look at buying less expensive, proven platforms to save money? And the second question would be, for looking at your charts, the personnel, the all-volunteer force, since around 2002, skyrocketing, right? So I know that the Congress and DOD have established a panel to look at compensation. I don't know where that's going to go. That's a very difficult one to sell to people. How do we rein in the personnel, healthcare, those costs?
Right. Let me take the second part first, having to do with compensation, so that I don't overlook it in giving the answer that I will also give on the first part. In showing you those figures, I'm not saying those figures are right or wrong. What I'm saying is that's where we are, and they have certain consequences for the composition of the budget. What it means, for example, is that if you take the Navy's budget and reduced it to, or changed it to where it was in 2005, or changed it to where it was in 2000, you could not get the same force structure that you were today that you were able to do in those other years, because in the meantime these other pressures have built up. I mean, that's what I was trying to illustrate. It wasn't to cast judgment on this. Now, DOD has proposed in successive budget submissions measures for beginning to stem the growth in personnel pay and benefits. And in Congress's action on the FY15 budget, they by and large did not accept the proposals that were in the 15th. There was a little bit that was accepted, some, but other things were not. And this is a dialogue that is going to continue. And it is a choice for policymakers to make. But the more that we spend in one area, the less we will have available for other things. And that's generally what I want to make people conscious of. I don't think it's quite so widely known just how much real growth there has been. And again, I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but that is a very large change in the composition of DoD spending to have occurred over the course of only a decade. And if you're not aware of it, then you can lead to yourself to certain incorrect conclusions about what it is you think you can afford in terms of force structure for a budget of a given size. Now, the first part of your question I have now forgotten because I was so good at doing the second part that I was afraid of forgetting about. Oh, okay, right. And are we buying less expensive ships? And I think the Navy would say that they've already taken a number of measures in that direction. You mentioned the Zumwalt, for example. Well, the Zumwalt program was truncated at 3 ships. And we've gone back now to the DDG-51, very much because its unit procurement cost was estimated to be significantly less than that of the Zumwalt class had it continued into serial production. But in addition to that, the Littoral Combat Ship is a huge program that was intended to put a less expensive ship into the force structure. And beyond that, the Joint High-Speed Vessel is another example of a program. And I'll give you even one more beyond that, which is the Mobile Landing Platform Ship for augmenting the capabilities of the Maritime Prepositioning Force. We had an expensive design for that. We came up with a much less expensive. So I think the Navy would say they've already taken a number of steps in that direction. Yes, we're still getting the Ford-class carriers. Yes, we're still getting very large and complex ships. But in fact, the projected composition of the Navy and the ships that we are buying to move us there now include categories or types of ships that are considerably less expensive. And they constitute a fairly large fraction of the fleet. In fact, before the program underwent the changes that were announced last February, the LCS program was scheduled to run to 52 ships, which would have been 1/6 of the fleet all by itself. And before you even add in things like the Joint High-Speed Vessel or a couple of MLPs. So I think the Navy would say they've already changed the mix that way, and by stopping the Zumwalt program and restarting the DDG-51 program to move in that kind of a direction. And I think there's one more example they would pick out at this point, which is the new LXR amphibious ship, which is a ship that has been scoped out and gone through its AOA very much under a fairly strict cost constraint for both lead ship and follow ships. And as a result, that ship will not have all the capabilities that people in the Marine Corps might prefer that new class of ships to have, because it is very cost constrained. But I think the Navy would also list that as yet another example of how they are trying to get their arms around the issue of unit procurement cost and make sure that their mix of ships in the main is more affordable than what it might have been had they not done all these things.
Hey, Ron. Kevin Donegan. First of all, thanks for a great presentation. But you talked about top line and you talked about the percentages of the budgets. But we also see this phenomenon of continuing resolutions that so we get a certain amount of money, but you get it with the caveats that the continuing resolution brings with it. Have you done studies to show what the impact on buying power is? I'm assuming negative impact that this continuing resolutions and the length of them impact the military service, because in the end we compare total top money that eventually got to the services, but it got to it with the caveats of no new starts and the rest of the things which hamstrings your ability to execute a plan.
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. You're right, because once you see the budget total in the history book, that didn't mean you got all that money in a way that was unencumbered, as it has been in more recent years by having to live for some number of weeks or months into the fiscal year under a CR. The upfront short answer is no, I and CRS have not done a study to try and put a price tag on the inefficiencies caused by the program disruptions that there are. I'm not sure, I don't think CBO has done anything like that either, and Eric's shaking his head no. In fact, it might only be DOD that's in a position to be able to document that, because only they could then go and do the survey among the hundreds of different program managers they would have to talk to try and put a number on that. But to characterize the way in which these inefficiencies can happen, there are several ways. First, CRs don't allow new program starts, typically. And so if that fiscal year was supposed to have a program start in it by a certain date, the CR may push that back. That may cause an inefficiency or a disruption of some kind. The CR limits quantity increases in existing programs from year to year. So if you did one destroyer in the prior year, the year that the CR is modeled after, and in this year you wanted to get 2, you're out of luck. A third way, and one where you can begin to attach a number if you were to play it out, if it were to become permanent, is that at least the most recent CR from a year ago also prohibited the signing of new multi-year procurement contracts. So we know what the savings of those are, and some fraction of that savings might be sacrificed by starting that multi-year procurement program later than you might have preferred. Or at least you would investigate whether that happened. And there's one other way in which a CR can cause program execution problems that's actually quite specific to Navy shipbuilding and is a source of program execution difficulties that are more particular for shipbuilding than they are for other sectors of defense. CRs are typically modeled after, they look to the DoD appropriation for the prior fiscal year, and they look to the letter of the law for that DoD Appropriation Act for the prior fiscal year. Now, if you were to go into the DoD Appropriation Act and look at how it's written, what it does is provide money for each of the various accounts in a little paragraph. For this purpose, you know, whether it's aircraft procurement, Air Force, or weapons procurement, Navy, there shall be a certain sum of money, and there might be some provisos after, but it's a little paragraph. And all of the paragraphs for all of the acquisition accounts in the DoD Appropriation Act are written that way, with one exception. And that's the paragraph for the shipbuilding account. For historical reasons that I think relate to the fact that ships are very big and expensive items, they're large, big-ticket items individually. The paragraph that provides funding in the DoD Appropriation Act for shipbuilding is written differently, and it's written in a way that calls out specific sums for each line item. So instead of providing money in a lump sum basis, it's called out line item by line item in the letter of the law. So when you write a CR for, let's say now, FY15, and it says it shall be based on FY14 spending, pretty much everybody and all the other procurement accounts will say, well, that's my lump sum, and I can take the lump sum from my account and figure out how best to use it to meet my FY15 needs. But you can't do that for shipbuilding. For shipbuilding, it's spelled out program by program. And if the fingers on my one hand here are the funding needs in FY14 for individual shipbuilding programs, and the fingers on my other hand are the funding needs for individual shipbuilding programs for FY15, they don't always match. They can go like that. They can miss one another. And you can get situations where a shipbuilding program has more money than it needs, which is a problem of money sitting around and not being used. But then you can have the other problem, where a program that needs $10 this year only got $5 last year, and is therefore limited under the CR to an annual spending rate equivalent to $5, and you don't have enough. This can create specific program execution problems in shipbuilding that are more particular than any other sector of defense, and it has to do with the fact that the DoD Appropriations Act, for historical reasons, happens to be written that way. And so when we get into a CR, I will call up the Navy Office of Legislative Affairs and ask them. I said, well, what's that going to cause in shipbuilding because of these program by program funding misalignments that can occur? And it can cause problems like that. And I guess we're going to have an issue like that on the destroyers, for example. And I mentioned it a minute ago. In 14, we got 1. In 15, we're requesting 2. You get a CR, you will only have enough money to spend on an annualized basis until that CR is replaced, equivalent to getting 1 rather than 2. And if your contract is set up, and this is a program that's in a multi-year procurement contract, and it calls out for having 2 instead of 1, uh-oh, what does that mean now for the execution of that multi-year procurement contract? Well, we've been able to manage these things and to hopefully minimize these disruptions, but they certainly don't help. And sometimes it requires passing a freestanding bill. We got into an execution problem on the CVN 72 RCOH a year ago, I guess it was, because we didn't have enough money due to this misalignment to finish up the CVN 72. We had to pass, I think, a freestanding bill to release that money. And so the further you get into a fiscal year, the more likely it is that one or more of these misalignment issues will begin to cause program execution pressures. And somewhere along the way, that probably does result in inefficiencies and probably does result in higher costs than if we had simply gotten the money through a regular DoD Appropriation Act in the first place. But I have not seen a study that actually puts a dollar figure on the value of that inefficiency or that disruption. And I think DoD might be the only people who would be in a position to have the documentation to actually compile that figure. I could give that really long answer because you told me I had more time.
Okay. I guess that's it.
Well, there's one more coming to the Captain. There's one more over on, or maybe not. Oh, okay. No, it wasn't a question.
Did somebody?
Yes, we have one more question.
Hi, I'm Phil Thomas with George Mason University. You portrayed those personnel costs and going up, and you suggested that there were efforts to kind of control them, but you didn't say specifically what they were, and I was wondering if you would do that.
I wouldn't call them efforts. I would call them proposals from the administration that were incorporated into the FY15 budget submission. And they have to do, I'm not an expert in the area, but one example it had to do with a copay for some of your medical visits. So some of it is in the medical care area. There was a proposal on pension reform, I guess, for flag level officers that actually was accepted, but that was by Congress, but that was a very small thing. But some of it is in the area of pay and compensation, of doing ECI and not ECI plus 0.5%. At least that's been an issue in the past. And some of it is in the area of health care and the payments that service members must make as a part of their health care arrangements. But I'm really at the ragged edge of my knowledge in telling you even that much, so I don't want to go beyond that.
Has anyone suggested deferring retirements? You know, extending them so that, you know, after 20 years, you don't retire, you have to stay on, you know, because the new 50 is like, you know, people live longer. It's a different world.
Right. Well, right now the system, as you know, it works toward vesting people at the 20-year point.
Right.
And I'm actually unfamiliar with what the proposals might be to do something other than that. Yeah, I have to plead ignorance on that. I'm sure it's a part of the discussion. I just don't know the particulars.
Good afternoon, Ron. Tom Marfiak, former budget person.
Right, I remember. Nice to see you again.
This isn't so much a question. I just want to amplify on what your excellent exegesis on the impact of continuing resolutions is, of having dealt with the problem of how you get new things started in an environment where you've got a continuing resolution. As you point out, the funding constraints, particularly for SCN budgets, are severe. What the economists talk about is a cost of opportunity, and so what you do is you impact the opportunity to start new things because the money simply isn't there to finance the research and development into an alternative ship type. You mentioned JHSVs, LCSs, and so on, or, for example, Arleigh Burke Flight 3, 4, 5, etc. You don't have those resources available to go ahead with the new ideas. And so it's a scramble, particularly with SCN research and development funds. You may have to go to industry to get IRAD support because it simply isn't going to be available. And that's the impact of, what is it now, 4 or 5 years worth of continuing resolutions that we've had going forward. So from a practitioner standpoint, everything Ron said is right on, but there's, in addition to that, the cost of opportunity. Thank you.
It's an excellent adjunct. And by the way, to add to the earlier question about less expensive ships, I don't want to overlook the fact that the Navy several years ago had in its plan a cruiser, and that cruiser was eliminated. There's no cruiser currently in the 30-year plan either. So we're not planning at this point based on the 30-year plan, to build a cruiser anytime soon. And the destroyer we're building is less expensive than the one that had originally been started. And so I didn't want to overlook that in the mix of things that I gave you in that answer. Thank you again for your time. I hope you found it valuable.
We want to present you with a copy of Naval Institute's new book by Admiral Stavridis. Title's questionable, The Accidental Admiral, but thank you. You are a national asset, and thanks for sharing your time with us.